One of the most surprising developers that's arisen over the last few years is the Osaka-based Vinillaware, staffed by a small team of artists who branched off from Atlas to create games with incredibly intricate and detailed drawings and animations. Made up of only a couple dozen people, each title is almost Ghibli-like in presentation, explaining their growing cult following. Vinillaware has produced beautiful art, though not necessarily great games, often hampered by repetition and a lack of mechanical diversity. Their first titles, GrimGrimoire and Odin Sphere, demonstrate their strengths and weaknesses. Since Odin Sphere has been faithfully updated, I prefer to look at their exclusively real-time strategy title of GrimGrimoire. Packed with charm, character, and a compelling narrative hook, it's a memorable game that uses its incredible graphics to facilitate the frequently samey and linear gameplay. The story of Grimoire is a seemingly generic Harry Potter excursion. As Lilith Lan, you arrive at the Advanced Magical Academy of the Tower of Silver Star, where she attends classes and lectures from various obtuse students and peculiar teachers, grasping the basics of summonings and spells before waking up on the 5th day, finding everyone dead. Yeah, it's a pretty intense turn of events, and before Lilith receives the same fate, she's thrown back 5 days to repeat the same cycle. With only her memories intact, Lilith must uncover the nature of the eventual disaster and those that fall, with seemingly every weirdo having some ulterior motive. This time-travelling mystery is like a combination of Groundhog Day and the visual novel Higurashi, with the ever-present threat of death looming. The colourful and very baroque art styles and the designs of the characters wouldn't have you think that, making their eventual fates all that more grim. It's pretty entertaining watching characters continually introduce themselves to Lilith's chagrin, all the while she keeps progressively gaining more knowledge and skills through the repetition of the week, leading to some humorous excuses. The setting can get a bit cluttered, with so many odd names and legends tossed around. There's no background text you can quickly refer to or catch up on. I'm not sure if it's just me, or perhaps something lost in translation, but I found myself getting lost in the myriad of dialogues. Still, the talented cast sorta keep it running, albeit very hammy and overly expressive, with some lines being very questionable.
Tell me to be your wife, and I will. Wish me to be your daughter, I would be.
Console-based real-time strategy games haven't developed a good track record outside the late 2000s, with N-War, Halo Wars, and Red Alert 3, which few remember, or at least fondly. Instead of trying to overcome the severe limitations of the PlayStation's hardware, Vinillaware instead chose simplicity in Grimoire's design, and it's a much better title for it. The game plays on a 2D plane where you use different grimoires to build runes and spawn familiars, all of which relies on collecting mana from large crystals. This is the extent of your base building and resource gathering systems, with the additional option of placing turrets to deter aggressors. It's a very easy system to grasp initially. The depth is the massive variety of units to spawn, as the only restriction is the population size and mana cost. There's 4 grimoire types: Alchemy, Sorcery, Glamour, and Necromancy. Each of these have unique units and abilities and are both strong and weak against different attacks. Glamour is made up of fairies and elves and is strong against Necromancy, which pulls its power from the underworld. These undead units can phase through the environment and are invulnerable against physical attacks, making the Sorcery class, primarily heavy-hitting tanks, very vulnerable, though they themselves can clear through the more technical and support-oriented Alchemy units. Understanding the rock, paper, scissors approach to the combat and the classes is the surest way to win most levels. Victory is mostly through destroying all the enemy's runes, which often isn't hard as they rarely rebuild their defenses, allowing you to gradually chip them away. The UI is workable but limited. Selecting, moving, and ordering units to attack is fine if tedious, and sometimes unresponsive, leading to their demise. You really have to specify exactly what you want them to do, especially when using spells. It's a good thing you can pause and issue orders, making the chaotic engagements manageable. You can only spawn a couple dozen units at once, presumably to handle performance which seems small, but it works surprisingly well at reducing the clutter and unit bloat. You'll instead establish a small, multi-rolled force. By making the player approach enemies with a mix of different classes, encourages a lot more experimentation than you'd expect. GrimGrimoire's highest default difficulty setting is normal, which, after a few hours, you realise it's quite easy to win nearly every stage. Enemies rarely counterattack or retake lost ground. As soon as you have a foothold, you've already kinda won. There's also units that are far too overpowered. Early on you can summon a Grim Malkin whose default magical attack puts any foe to sleep, regardless of their strength. Once you realise this, you'll always have a few tagging along, paralysing any real threat. There's also a special unit for each of the 4 Grimoire types, like a Dragon or Chimera. These guys can absolutely devastate the opposition, and are fairly easy to spawn, so often you just take the resource hit and spawn them, after which the enemies can barely touch you. If you do lose, however, the punishment is pretty high, as there are no checkpoints or mid-level saves, so losing 40 minutes of progress is pretty grueling. I do admit, Grimoire is much better than most other typical strategy games, but since the difficulty modes are limited, and there's no online or competitive options, you're stuck with a fairly predictable AI opponents. It's fatiguing going through the same skirmishes where the beautiful backgrounds and solid orchestral pieces become boring. There's maybe 3 actual pieces of battle music, and after a dozen hours of the same melodies, you'd rather anything else. GrimGrimoire is more of a solid concept instead of a refined product, as Vinillaware would significantly improve in their later titles, with Dragon's Crown and Odin's Sphere receiving a lot more polish, and as a result, hold up far better as action RPG titles. Is it worth playing? Well, maybe. The original PS2 versions are now collector's items. Luckily, the re-release on the PlayStation Network has made it a lot more accessible. Grimoire is a decent title that lacks the variety of freedom that other strategy games offer, aside from its decent main story. However, besides collecting it for its rarity, if you're looking for a casual RTS and are appealed to by Vinillaware's distinctive art style, you will find satisfaction in this forgotten tale.
I somehow did it.